Hey, Skiff listeners, hear about the latest trends in the travel industry with the Brand USA Talks Travel podcast. Right now, listen to special live from IPW interviews featuring U.S. Travel's Jeff Freeman.
DMOs are at the heartbeat of U.S. travel.
Liz Bittner from Travel South.
A lot of key gateway markets are back.
LA Tourism's Adam Burke.
We all win when we all partner together.
Plus, Brand USA's Stacey Melman and Jackie Ennis with international travel trends and Chris Thompson's farewell finale. I'm Mark Lapidus. Join us for Brand USA Talks Travel on your favorite podcast platform.
Brand USA Talks Travel.
Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the Skiff Travel Podcast. I am Sarah Kopit, Skiff's editor-in-chief, joined, as always, by Seth Borko, Skiff's head of research. And today we have a very special guest. Colin Nagy is here, and we are going to talk about not just luxury travel, not just ultra luxury travel. We are going to talk about the type of travel that people do when they've got a couple $1 million to spend on a vacation. So, when's the last time you went on a $1 million vacation, Seth?
You know, you just got back from one, I think. No, it's been.
I would say you were off last week, weren't you?
Yeah, that was not quite a $1 million vacation. It's been let's say it's been a while, maybe even never. It's a big trip.
Yeah. And Colin, you are kind of our luxury guru here at Skift. I can't wait to get into it, see what you have to say about the ultra high net worth set and what they are doing these days.
So, Sarah, what do we mean by ultra high net worth? You wrote this great piece about luxury travel for the Uber jet set, the private jet set. What do you mean by ultra high net worth, and what kind of people are we talking about here?
Yeah, so I was kind of trying to figure out where the threshold is, but I was basically talking about people who have between maybe $30 and $50 million in assets. So we're not really talking about people who are worried about a budget. This is and when I talk to kind of the providers who plan these trips and who do these experiences and experiential travel, which was the common theme across the board, they said that what's important for their clients and these travelers, it was security, it was exclusivity, and more than anything, like assuming you can get those two pieces right, those were like just requirements. What they wanted to do was have an experience that kind of nobody else had, or that was like these once in a lifetime, or, these very high touch, very kind of thrilling, things that they could go back, and talk to their friends and family about. Like they wanted to really have an adventure. And that was kind of the theme that I found across the board about these sorts of travels. I'm curious, Colin, is that what you have? Like, tell me what you're hearing from kind of the moneyed set about what the latest in vogue travel trends are.
It's very interesting because I was listening the other day to a podcast called Acquired, and they did a history of Hermes, and they talked about all of these like social signifiers that came with the first Americans that were kind of like traveling to Europe, and it was like definitely you had to have the right things, but more than anything, it was a kind of conversational social status, right? And I think what we've done is we've just pumped this full of human growth hormone, and we're in the same place in that it is about, and I'm not trying to be very reductionist here, so I'm trying to be thoughtful, but it really is about the social capital of having these ridiculously rarefied experiences that are kind of like off limits or off the menu, and whether a lot of this is related to exploration. So I was speaking to someone in London last week, and he said, the Explorers Club, this kind of rarefied space in New York City on the Upper East Side with, a lot of taxidermy and a lot of gravitas. Most of the only, the people keeping that alive are the billionaires who are funding these like insane sort of expeditions and things that are a little bit more bragging rights oriented than perhaps the sort of scientific furthering of science. And so the top line is same as it ever was, bragging rights and having the drugs that are a little bit better than everyone else, so to speak.
Well, I think one of the things I'm hearing you say, Colin, I think it's kind of interesting is I was sort of thinking about it from the perspective too of the commoditization of mass travel. Whereas a decade ago, a trip to Antarctica would have been truly cutting edge, truly once in a lifetime. And I kind of joke with my fiance's father, like there's no such thing really as a once in a lifetime trip. You just need to pay. And for these kind of people, they can pay to go on 1 million Antarctica cruises. And so as the things that would have been, is that kind of what you're seeing? Like those things that would have been bragging rights, like chartering a boat to Antarctica, as those become available to the masses, you need to go higher and higher into ever kind of rarefied air.
This is exactly what we're talking about. You know, when you look at the things that perhaps might used to be social capital, you know, the really rarefied place on the Amalfi Coast that's like pretty much the thing that everyone is doing now. So everyone's looking for something a little bit stronger, but we're taking it to interesting ends, you know, where it requires a level of security, logistics, and perhaps in the case of subsea exploration or rocket exploration, a amount of technical savoir-faire and risk. And I think what I really liked about what Sarah put in her piece is this is all not dissimilar from the Michael Douglas movie, The Game, because it's like, you know, when all of the accoutrement, when the silver, when the perfect sheets stop making you feel, perhaps it's adrenaline, perhaps it's fear, perhaps it's something else that is the thing. And I think that that's kind of the comical undertone with this at the most extreme levels. It's when people have developed a mental callus where the normal things kind of don't get through. It requires something perhaps a little bit sharper to cut through.
So that's like poetry, Colin. I love it. So, you know, it was interesting when I talked to Polaris, and I will say, like, I was a bit of like a fan, you know, when I was talking to Jimmy Carroll. He was in New York, and you know, he was telling me that they do their own version of the game, but even more than that, he said what is interesting in what they do, and I also asked him, how often do you do these kind of like role playing kind of, you know, adventures? And he said not very often. It's not like their primary bread and butter. But he said, but even in the trips that are more like, you know, anniversaries, birthdays, just like dad takes his daughter to, he told me a story about a dad who took his daughter, I believe it was to New Zealand. They were in a helicopter and it was just, you know, a sightseeing trip, but they were landing, it was about lunchtime, and all of a sudden they saw, you know, a person that was in a place where like maybe a person shouldn't be. And they were like, oh, maybe we need to go and help him. And so they landed the helicopter and they got off, and the guy had like an injured leg and had a pot with him. And it was like, oh, are you okay? And it turned out this was like the cook or the chef, yes, who had lunch for them. And he had to happen to injure his legs, like getting lobsters or clams out of the ocean where they were. So it just kind of added to it. But it was like this little tiny role play within what was a typical trip, just to add a little bit more interest or a little bit more excitement, that little pop of the unknown, pop of adrenaline. And then they had, you know, clams on the beach.
Was the chef really interested? Was the chef really injured, or was it a role play?
He was He was really injured. He did actually. That was not part of the plan. They helped. You know, it was cut himself on a rock or something. But he said it really did. It added to like the mystery and the danger.
I think danger kind of just to pick up on that thread and then maybe throw it back to you a little bit, Colin, too. Like, I think danger kind of is the key word here, because you were earlier talking about the Explorers Club and about these expeditions and the cutting edge of science sort of stuff, like where there's a world where these expeditions mix science with leisure. The thing is that at the Explorers Club, you fund a professional explorer, and they've presumably been doing this for a very long time and know what to do. But this sort of gets into the almost Everest-esque kind of thing, where you pay someone to carry you to the top. Well, there's a lot of debate over that, whether they're actually being carried or not.
Yeah.
But there's a big difference between exploration and tourism, and when the billionaires themselves or multimillionaires themselves go into space, there's a huge, as we saw, like my favorite part of your story, Sarah, was the submersible. As we saw with that famous Titanic submersible, there's a huge amount of risk involved in some of these activities.
Yeah, it's a great point. There was a famous Everest expedition that I think turned into was the basis of the John Krakauer book.
Into Thin Air, yeah.
Into Thin Air. And so at that point, what you're alluding to is completely right. In the past, it was just the most thoroughbred of mountaineers who had punched their ticket on other mountains, whether that's Annapurna, K2, etc., serious people, right? And that expedition was, I don't want to say the beginning, but the early stages of what we're talking about, which is where you had these people who were probably like medium level climbers that were hyper funded, had all of the accoutrement, including, creature comforts, at Everest Base Camp, who were basically buying the ticket. And what's interesting about Everest is, it's not technically, if you go up the way that this group went up, it's not technically a difficult climb, but it's it's basically like an ice cube tray being held upside down. It's like, when are you going to get a slide? All of these things that you can't control. And so it was more or less the bragging rights, the brand name of Everest, that then created a cottage industry of people who would be like, hey, I'll get you up there if you could pay. But with this comes so many moral, ethical, and other dilemmas that hey, does money mean that I have the right to do this? And it has led to a lot of overcrowding, a lot of tragedy, a lot of death on Everest as it relates to people that don't know what they're doing, people that aren't prepared, and perhaps, as you alluded to, putting so much emphasis on the Sherpas to carry all the stuff, to do all the hard yards, et cetera, to basically create bumper bowling for these unqualified climbers, where there's so it is interesting. There are ethical dilemmas to this when we're pushing things to the edge. And I found it very interesting that this has become a cottage industry for some of these former kind of British SAS types and kind of special forces characters, because they probably have the understanding of how to mitigate the risk, have fastidious preparation, et cetera, but the question is how much on the risk threshold should be in play for these types of things.
Yeah, I talked to Jimmy a lot about that, and he was really interesting. I would love to go back right now and find the exact quote, but he was basically like, yeah, it helps a lot when you have been in places of conflict and real conflict. And then when you're in, and he chose his words very carefully, but basically it's like when you're on a vacation with a very rich person where there's not a lot, like you're able to really like put these like little tiny things aside and really just concentrate on their comfort. And so it was an interesting thing that he said. Basically, it's like these little tiny threats that maybe the client might see as risky and exciting as somebody who's been in a place of real conflict, Iraq, Afghanistan, whatever. Like, we're able to really deal with that. So that was his nod to that, and he also told me, I didn't write about this in the piece, but he told me that there was another group that they were taking out in Colorado to do some recon and extraction. Like, they were going to drop them, like recreate, special forces type of thing, drop them off in the wilderness, and kind of that's what they wanted to do. It was like a team building exercise, and they like set them all up with, it wasn't like a role play so much as these were a bunch of guys that wanted to kind of, with the bumpers on, go out and have this like thrilling close to death experience without there being any chance of actually dying.
And I think what's interesting is, at a baseline level, this is probably similar to what people do with I believe it's Outward Bound, right, where you do your kind of you do your solo, where you're responsible for XYZ. There still is safety, but you are kind of you're by yourself. And the reaction here is almost a reaction to the fact that everyone is kind of on all the time, the stresses of M&A deals, the stresses of the things that kind of come with being one of these apex predators of capitalism. And, it mirrors a lot of the reductionist stuff that we're seeing in broader society, right? It also, there's a movement to dumb phones, right? There's a movement to like, I don't want everything to be in front of me at all times. So it makes sense that there's a territory of a little bit of this survivalist nature, a little bit of this reductionist nature, and back to the land nature. And then I guess it's just how far they're pushing this into the beyond. And the Venn diagram here is also with the Peter Thiels of the world and the kind of like uber lux prepper type stuff. There's definitely some similarities to what you've been writing, Sarah, and the kind of creation of these Plan Bs in New Zealand and things like that. So it's almost like contingency planning, and also needing the stronger hit of dopamine or whatever that you can't get from other things.
Can I ask a bit of an open-ended question to this group? And I'm not sure if it's something we've thought about, but when you talk to a special forces guy or whatever, come the military, and they talk about risk, their job is to mitigate risk, but they're taking risk. Like, their job is, some of these risks are just, you can't mitigate this risk to zero. It's there. If you're in Afghanistan, you can minimize risk, but you can't reduce it. If you take a Carnival Cruise Line, they do everything in their damn, power. There is no risk. You ride a Disney ride, it's actually mitigated to effectively to zero. And there's a big difference between someone who says with very high confidence, there are real risks here, but I have minimized all the risks within my control, versus Disney saying, we've engineered this, imagineered this ride to the 99th percentile. Do you think that the customers recognize that difference? Do you think that ultra high net worth clients who get kidnapped are thinking that this is just a really fancy Disney ride with zero risk? Or do you think they have that kind of SAS special forces mindset where they're saying, I'm okay with taking real bodily harm risk? And I mean, what do we think?
Well, in Jimmy's situation with the kidnappers, the birthday boy was the only one who knew.
Yeah, true.
So the friends didn't know, although I don't know how much that whole thing. I mean, I asked him so many questions about that whole thing was just fascinating to me. But I also asked him, when talking about risk, I said, well, you've got you're dealing with people with a lot of money. Like, in my limited experience of dealing with the ultra wealthy, like, they generally get what they want. So how do you manage that? He's like, it's actually pretty easy. He said, and this is also where the military training comes in handy. He's like, there are two things that we take very seriously, and no is no. And if you want to, stomp off and not pay us, that's fine. And it's weather and animals. He says those are the two things that, like, if the weather's bad and we're not going to fly in the helicopter, we're not going to do the thing, like whatever it is, we're just simply not doing it. Like full stop, like we're not going. And the same thing, like if you're dealing with a safari or like a certain situation, like if so-and-so wants to go up and, touch the lion, like, no, we're not doing that. And he said that the way that they do it to get around or to make sure the client is happy is just to have like multiple plan, B, C, D, E, and F, which makes complete sense, and I was like, well, have you ever had to do it? Have you ever had to tell people no? And he said, oh yeah, like all the time. He's like, it's almost always weather. They wanted to go do their thing, but like, because they also have a yachting division. They have like an aircraft division. We can talk about the spaceships and the blimps later, but it's storms come in and then you can't do those things.
I think what's so interesting about this is a lot of these aforementioned apex predators of capitalism,
I love that.
And maybe not.
Is that a title of a book? Yeah, I love it.
Yeah, it
should be.
And I'm not saying they're all these sort of Carl Icahn figures or whatever, but they're pretty good at understanding risk in terms of like a deal, in terms of their day-to-day life. So what's interesting is the translating of that into like 4D chess, and it's very interesting to me to hear the way these guys are talking about risk mitigation. And turns out helicopters in bad weather equals potential disaster, or an untrained guide with an elephant that charges. There was a woman that was just killed a few days ago. I can't remember where it was in Africa, but elephant charged. And it's very interesting when you talk to these guides. They know, like the really, really good ones know. They know all of the risk mitigation. I've been in many situations in Africa where the guide's like, stop, turn around, get out of here, because the subtle body language of an animal is like, I've had enough of this. But on the other side, with people that know what they're doing, you can do a walking safari. You can get within a short amount of space to a lion or something else, but the lion has freshly killed something. It's been eating. The way you approach it, like the smell, you're not surprising it. You know what I mean? Like all of these things are these in hidden variables that are kind of like finely attuned to the thing. And so what's interesting here is the professionalism that comes with a life in expeditionary situations, with some of these guys, is also the contingency planning, the ability to effortlessly kind of pivot and get into those different courses of action, while kind of preserving the juice, right? Preserving the experience. And my fear with a lot of this stuff is if this continues to become super popular, is you get a bunch of wannabes that are doing these things and bad things happen, right? So there needs to be a certain amount of professionalism and background and rigor that goes into this when it's the management of lots of variables, and the attention to detail is what keeps people alive. So pretty interesting to think about.
Which is almost exactly what happened on Everest, whereas even in 96, when Into Thin Air happened, only the hardiest people were going with only the best guides on Everest 20 years ago. And today, I won't speak too much specifically about this one thing, but I think similar things have happened, and I can imagine other experiences. I think you're so right. It's about that consistency and quality, and how do you scale this up? And maybe that's what makes it luxury, is that it doesn't scale well.
Let's take a break here, and we'll be back with Colin Nagy.
Hey, Skiff listeners, hear about the latest trends in the travel industry with the Brand USA Talks Travel podcast. Right now, listen to special live from IPW interviews featuring U.S. Travel's Jeff Freeman.
DMOs are at the heartbeat of U.S. travel.
Liz Bittner from Travel South.
A lot of key gateway markets are back.
LA Tourism's Adam Burke.
We all win when we all partner together.
Plus, Brand USA's Stacey Melman and Jackie Ennis with international travel trends and Chris Thompson's farewell finale. I'm Mark Lapidus. Join us for Brand USA Talks Travel on your favorite podcast platform.
Brand USA Talks Travel.
Welcome back to the Skiff Travel Podcast. We are talking about ultra high net worth luxury travel today. So, Seth, I just wrote a piece. We talked a lot about the numbers that back up that this trend is very much actually occurring out there in the wild. Pun very much intended, I guess. Tell us about what you all at Skift Research have found about the patterns, likes, dislikes, and where the very rich are opening their wallets.
Yeah, absolutely. So, a couple of months ago, we did a luxury travel survey. Now, luxury certainly encompasses these ultra high net worth, but we've been talking about so far has been, again, really rarefied air. But the trend holds. I mean, we've seen research out there suggesting that this is an over $1 trillion, I think $1.3 trillion market globally. Really interesting. We asked people by income, how important is travel to you? What we saw is, people in almost every income bracket and every walk of life will tell you that travel is important to them. Those making, let's say, $200,000 to $300,000 a year, 60% said that travel is a extremely important part of who they are, or a very important part of who they are. Once you're over 500K, which is, again, we're talking about millions here, but over 500K, very few Americans make over $500,000. It jumps from 60% to 80%. So you will already have travel such an important part of the psyche and of how they kind of define themselves and relative to themselves and their peers, exactly like Colin was talking about. That number jumps dramatically. And when you ask these luxury travelers what's most important to them, we get many of the things that you would expect. Number one is exceptional service and attention to detail. That's probably the single most important luxury trait that we saw, followed very closely by exclusivity and privacy. And I think all of these things very much track with the conversation we've been having. And then in terms of what people want, they're looking for those authentic cultural experiences. They're looking for, like I said, exclusivity. Many of them are looking for adventure and outdoor travel. And you'd be surprised how many, in fact, so many of these experiences we've talked about are outdoor adventure trip. You'd be surprised how many 55 plus luxury travelers tell us that they do outdoor trips like hiking and outdoor activities. It's very much a part of this conversation as well. So that's just a little bit of a data dump there on what we're seeing on our end. I think it ties a lot with what we're talking about. Colin, I might ask you one question though, if I could, on this. What we saw in our survey, single most important thing to luxury travelers is that exceptional service, that attention to detail. That's traditionally thought of as, these ultra luxe hotels. And I know you know that world very well. Whereas these bushwhacking in Mount Everest Base Camp, not necessarily known for its impeccable service. Is there a circle to square there, or is there maybe a learn-in for luxury hotels? Like, how do we think about those two things? Are they in contradiction, or do they work together? How do you think about that traditional white glove luxury paired with this more adventurous ultra luxe?
I think we're actually getting to a space where some of these travelers, the traditional codes of ultra luxury don't even affect them anymore, and maybe it is the experience of the sort of austere tent in a beautiful environment that is the thing, because their homes and their places are often nicer than the places that they're staying in. So it might just be the flipping of the script into something that is like pure, purity of experience, like a perfect remote cabin with nothing. Perhaps it is this austerity that is the thing. You certainly see the range of it, but I think with this particular audience, I think it's a little bit more focused around the thing that they're doing that no one else can do, rather than the thread count of the sheets or having the Kona coffee in the morning. That would just be a bit of an assumption, right? There are things, that Depler Farm in Iceland. It's a very uh, super high end, adventure minded place, but it does have all of the accoutrement of a very very high end thing. A lot of the Singita will set up a tent for you in the middle of one of their concessions where you're basically out with a guide having this extremely um, rarefied experience, but you're not sacrificing for any creature coverage. So I believe it's a little bit on a spectrum here. There are probably some people that are like, I only care about the rarity of the thing that I'm doing. But in the middle of the spectrum, it's like I want to do something incredible and I don't want it to miss a thing in terms of what I come to expect.
Yeah, that's what a lot of these tour operators really excel in. That I found. I mean, I don't know how many of them there are out there operating at this level, but I talked to Space VIP, which is a company that offers like 3 different types of experience: Earth, ocean, and space. Space VIP is their name, but they arrange for these tours, and they were also the ones with the space balloons, which I'm really excited about the space balloons. Colin, are the space balloons on your radar? Like, had you heard about this?
I'm starting to
I had not.
I'm starting to understand that there are things that allow you to get at such a level where you can kind of see the curvature of the Earth,
Yes.
but it's not.
Yes.
You're probably not having rockets, thrusters, all of that danger involved.
Correct.
So
Correct.
it is
Yes.
interesting because we're getting to this point of like super rarefied experience. However, risk is significantly mitigated because there's not a
Correct.
fire and thrust and propulsion involved.
You're not sitting on a bomb.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah.
So that's kind of interesting, and I'm sure that you will start to see the business minded massification of some of these experiences that are not as super dangerous, right?
Yeah, so like the Space VIP was telling me about this space balloon. None of them have gone up yet. I just saw an artist rendering of it, but it's like a 6-hour trip. It's a pressurized capsule in that's pulled up into the Earth's atmosphere by a balloon. And you can see the curvature of the Earth, you can see the blackness of space, and you can have a like triple thousand Michelin star deal or meal with cocktails while you're doing it. 6 hours, takes off from a boat, lands like in near the boat in the water. And these are the things in the space, like in the space race that or like the new tourism space race that are really, really interesting to me. So it's, Musk, Branson, Bezos, they've got all their tourism rockets and like they've got really interesting plans, but it's still a rocket. And it's still like we're very far away from that being mass marketed. But you've got these other kind of ships, crafts, balloons, like very science fiction, very cool, that are really like there's a lot of money being put into it, a lot of time, effort, backing, people who are really working on this as, an economy in our collective travel space that's going to really come online in the next couple of years.
I think that there's
with far little risk.
There's a
less
lot of
risk.
The social capital that's going to come from flying some of these new, the future of where the Concorde left off, right? You have boom,
Yeah.
you have the return of supersonic flight. So no longer will it be bragging rights to be flying on Emirates first or something like that. It's like, oh no, I got from A to B in an hour and a half, right? Which was the initial value proposition of Concorde. So it is along the lines of kind of what you're getting at here, Sarah. Technology enabling some of this stuff that wasn't, that had disappeared or is no longer around.
You know what it also reminded me of? Like it just kind of took me back. It's like everything that's old is new again, right? Is all of these conversations. It reminded me of like the French court circa the 1700s. Like the worst thing in the world would be to be boring, right? It's like that is the worst insult. I forget the movie that I was watching.
Well, you're talking
where that
about
was the point.
you're talking about that. I was thinking of the most dangerous game, that little short story about hunting man, kind of as we go into this almost absurdist level of
Yeah.
decadence, perhaps.
I actually asked Jimmy about if they would ever do like big game hunting, like as part of their, and he was like, nope, hard no, absolutely not. And I was like, oh, interesting. I didn't really expect, like, that wasn't exactly what I expected him to say, I guess, because, and, he's like, I don't know, it might be more of like a cultural thing in the US, but they're basically mostly in Europe. And he was like, yeah, no. That was it. That's the whole story on that. But I was surprised that he shut that one down and was like, yeah, even talk about that anymore.
It's interesting. I think that, a lot of this game stuff is just so tasteless. You see these people on Instagram that are kind of posing with stuff that really shouldn't be hunted. That being said, I do think, for some animals that need to be controlled, that the population is too much, I do think that there is a role to be a conservationist and a hunter. But I think the danger of some of this stuff is like, I want the stuff that I'm not supposed to have. I want the stuff that's going extinct. And that gets really scary. And like when we look at the reason for rhinos being poached and killed, it's because of some, I won't get into the geopolitics of it, but there is a significant market demand for some of this stuff, whether it's medicinal, whether it's ornamental. So this gets into a really dangerous territory when it comes to the people that can have whatever they want.
Colin, I think what you're raising is a really interesting point, that there's a difference between price and taste, maybe, and this maybe even comes back to the French court a little bit, which is that some of these big game hunting trips can be incredibly expensive. Like you need to spend tens, if not hundreds of thousands. I mean, we're talking millions, but tens, if not hundreds of thousands, maybe even millions of dollars for some of these permits and to get to these places and to assemble a team and to do all this stuff. And yet you just called it, and I think you're not far off, called it a little bit tacky. And so there's a big difference between having money and spending it on. It's interesting. There's an element of taste making in these ultra luxury trips where it's not just about splashing down $1 million and going on a crazy trip. It's about, I don't know, you're better at putting your finger on this than I am, Colin, but there's something to there that I wanted to maybe double click on there.
I've been saying for a long time, even just with typical luxury experiences, that, for these hotels that can kind of educate or introduce guests to something new via partnerships, via gastronomy or whatever, you're giving the guest a little bit of social capital, but then they go home and they're kind of like, oh, look how enlightened I am. But that's the kind of alpha that exists in hospitality. It's no longer a lot of things have been commoditized, right? In terms of the bed, in terms of the marble bathroom, all of these things. So it is this sort of like intangible of what a property can give in terms of knowledge or in terms of like cachet. So that is the juice that I really hear from a lot of people, that is the value, that they get out of these types of stays. And, as part of that, the cultural currency that stems from that. When you go home, you're a lady who lunches in Dallas, Texas, and you're sitting at your place and you're like, oh, you wouldn't believe the things we just did, yada, yada, yada. It's the equivalent of like putting on a little slideshow, for what you got back from your national park travel. But this is the human growth hormone version of that.
One thing I really did want to note too, and this is where, I don't know if the taste comes in or whatever, but every single one of the providers that I talked to me a lot about conservation. They talked to me a lot about giving back. They talked a lot about education. It was it was very important and very sincerely held with them. And Polaris has a foundation. Blue Origin has its own STEM related foundation. They all Triton was talking about how, when they go down deep, they almost always bring back scientific samples. They work with oceanographers. These things, they're almost always dual purposed, because I think that there is an awareness that these experiences and what they're doing, it's special. It's not, to lose that just for the possibility of somebody going on vacation, that would be wasteful. And so they don't do that. And that is very important to them.
Yeah. I would throw out one more point from our research. We did this luxury travel survey and we got these open-ended responses, and we asked people to say, what to you is luxury? And I was actually just scrolling through this. I saw this quote, and this anonymous respondent, luxury respondent, though, wealthy person, says, luxury travel is not really about opulence anymore. They said that to them. It's about finding the perfect balance between indulgence, exploration, and personal enrichment. I like that quote a lot. And that last bit of personal enrichment, maybe that's what the subs have that like Hunting a Lion doesn't really have in the same way. I don't know. What do you think about that? The personal enrichment piece of it.
Yeah, no, they said that as well. That is one of the main things that their clients all really want, is these experiences to grow as humans. Yeah. For that to be a part of these trips.
I think that's a great point for me to end on. I think for me, that's not just what luxury travel is about, but much of travel is about learning more about the world and ourselves. And I love that note to end on any tourism conversation. With that, we're going to end it there. And thank you all for joining us so much on this episode of the Skift Travel Podcast with Seth and Sarah. Colin, thank you so much for joining us. It's been a real pleasure.
Thank you, Colin.
We covered a lot of territory. It was emotional.
It was. Colin has recommended the favorite hotel I've ever stayed at. It was really a pleasure to have him on here, and we hope to have him on again soon. If you enjoyed this episode of the Skift Travel Podcast, let us know. Give us a like, rate us 5 stars, give us some sort of feedback. And if you want us to talk about your topic on the next Skift Travel Podcast, we take questions. So be sure to give us an email. It's podcasts@skift.com. We read everything that comes in there. And if you want to suggest a topic or have us answer one of your questions live on air, please do so. And until then, that's it. That's all the housekeeping. So we'll see you on the next episode.
And if you want to know what that hotel is, you have to tune in next week. And it's going to be my first question to you, Seth. Bye, everybody.
Bye, everyone. Thank you.
See ya. Thank you for listening to the Skift Travel Podcast. Wherever you're listening, please make sure to subscribe. If you like what you're hearing, rate us 5 stars or leave us a positive review. It really helps get the word out about us, our podcast, and make sure that we can still continue to bring it to you free of charge every week.
If you're watching on YouTube, be sure to like and subscribe. And don't forget to hit that notification bell as well. That way you'll know every time we have a new episode.